Hello, my name is Emma Simone, and this is my presentation on Chapter 5 of Robert Altler's The Art of the Biblical Narrative. So, it's a reflection on the techniques of repetition. So, who is Robert Alter? Robert Alter is a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He is a member of the American Academy of Art and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and is past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. He has twice been a Guggenheim Fellow, and he's been a Senior Fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, and Old Dominion Fellow at Princeton University. Professor Alter has written widely on the European novel from the 18th century to the present, on contemporary American fiction, and on modern Hebrew literature. He has also written extensively on the literary aspects of the Bible. His 22 published books include 2 prize-winning volumes of biblical narrative and poetry and award-winning translations of Genesis and the 5 books of Moses. So Alter starts his work in chapter 5 by explaining that there has traditionally been several explanations why the Bible often seems repetitive. Most of these explanations have to do with the fact that the Bible was traditionally shared orally, and so this repetition allows for people to catch the narrative. And in his work, he uses the example of repetition in speaking about the plagues that Moses brings to Egypt. And he describes that if you were in a crowd, you may not hear when God commands Moses about what to do, but you might pick up on it later on when those same instructions are repeated as they happen. He explains that there has been 3 kind of basic ideas around why the Bible is so repetitive. He ascribes the least amount of merit to this idea that it's repetitive because of scribal error, so that it repeats because people wrote it down and they lost their place and then had to write it down again. The 2 other explanations that have often been used is the one of oral tradition, and that was the traditional way of transmission, and also the relationship of the Hebrew Bible to traditional folklore. And each of these have some merit according to Alter. So he starts with an example of this concept, which I'm going to butcher the German, but he calls it Leadwortstil, or a leading word style. So he sets up the idea of leading word style, and he speaks about how the same style is used in other literary works. He uses the definition that the original coiner of the phrase used. And so it is that a leadwort is a word or word root that recurs significantly in a text, in a continuum of text, or in a configuration of text. By following these repetitions, one is able to decipher or grasp a meaning of the text, or at any rate, the meaning will be revealed more strikingly. The repetition, as we have said, need not be merely of the word itself, but also of the word root. In fact, the very difference of words can often intensify the dynamic action of the repetition. I call it dynamic because between combinations of sounds related to one another in this manner, a kind of movement takes place. If one imagines the entire text deployed before them, one can sense waves moving back and forth between the words. The measured repetition that matches the inner rhythm of the text, or rather that wells up from it, is one of the most powerful means of conveying meaning without expressing it. So he speaks that some of this has been lost because of the reality of translations. Alter uses an example about how key terms of listen, voice, and word repeat in Samuel, or how the terms recognize, man, master, slave, and house are repetitive in the Joseph narrative in Genesis. So then Alter then starts to propose a scale of repetitive structuring. And so he starts with layout words, where the word root is exposed and then played with complete opposites. And the example that he uses of this is the going and returning themes in Ruth. So Naomi and her husband leave Bethlehem and go to Moab. And then Naomi returns to Bethlehem, and she brings with her Ruth and Orpah. Now, Orpah decides to return to Moab, but Ruth goes on to Bethlehem. And so this theme of going and returning is continuous throughout the book of Ruth. Second, he talks about a motif. And a motif is when an object, action, image, or sensory quality is repeated. So one of the examples that Alter speaks about is the dreams in Joseph. Joseph has the dreams that he tells his brothers, and that's what makes them dislike him so much. He interprets dreams in prison, which help his fellow inmates. And finally, he interprets the king's dreams, which prophesies the coming famine. Third, there's this idea of theme, which is an idea that's often speaking to a value and is repeated. One example of this that's used throughout the Bible is how the younger sibling often inherits or is favored over the olders. So Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his brothers is favored, David over his brothers, Solomon over his brother, and so on and so forth. The fourth kind of level of repetition that Alter talks about is a sequence of actions. And Alter explains that quite often these sequence of actions are grouped into threes, which usually culminates at either a reversal or climax in the third time. Alter says that this style is the one that's most closely tied to folklore. An example of this is when the three captains approach Elijah at the beginning of 2 Kings. The first two have a fiery end, but the third pleads for mercy and is spared. And finally, Alter talks about how there are these repetitive type scenes. So these repetitive scenes that often are important events in the hero's life. And so one of the examples that he uses is the betrothal that happens at the well, which happens in various characters' lives throughout the Old Testament. And so the image that I'm showing here on the slide is from the story of Rebecca being found at the well and then betrothed to Isaac. So what do I think about some of this repetition? So in reflecting on it, one that Alter spoke of and that I often remember and go back to in my own life is this idea that God was with Joseph. So in the story of Joseph in Genesis, God is always with Joseph. No matter what happens to Joseph, there's always kind of this repetitive phrase, but God was with Joseph. And so that's brought me a lot of comfort over the years, beyond being also sort of a repetitive reminder that even though all these things are happening to Joseph within the narrative, there's kind of this idea in that story that it's part of God's plan. And so this repetitive phrase kind of reminds one that the story of Joseph is leading to something bigger. One of the other stories that Alter mentions is Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and kind of talks about how, we see kind of that theme of three that he talked about, even in our own folklore. So in Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the story's, of course, very repetitive. There's three different scenarios that Goldilocks comes upon: the chairs, the porridge, and the beds. There's the repetitiveness of it's too hot or too hard, it's too soft or too cold, and then of course it's just right. And then when the bears get home, it's the same kind of repetitiveness. There's three bears, um, each bear finds that theirs has been disturbed, and it's always the third one, the little bear, always finds out that his has been eaten all up, or his chair has been broken, or his bed has a girl in it. And so it's easy to see how Alter's trying to compare these two things. And so I wonder what other childhood folklore stories that we can think of that use kind of that three-part repetitiveness, and that we can see that kind of in our own childhood and in our own folklore. I also have noticed, and often the lectionary pulls out for those of us who are preaching, that there's always parallels that the gospel writers also take from the Hebrew scripture and try and parallel it with stories. So there's kind of this repetition of stories that compare Jesus to people who've gone before. And so because this week we are reading 1st and 2nd Kings, the example that comes to my mind is at the end of 2nd Kings 4, when Elisha feeds 100 men. And that story where there's this impetus to want to feed the masses that are there for the prophecy, but there isn't enough food, but there's a little bit of food, and all of a sudden it goes through the whole crowd, in this case of 100, and there's leftovers at the end. And of course, when you look at the Gospels, there's this continuing story of Jesus feeding the masses in a similar way, always with a group of leftovers at the end. And so it's interesting to see how the Gospel, in kind of thinking about this idea of repetition, I think one of the things that was interesting to me was thinking about what Bible stories from sort of the oral tradition of the Hebrew scriptures the gospel writers chose to kind of parallel their experience of Jesus with. Was also thinking a lot and would be interested in other people's thoughts about what does this mean as we move away from kind of this more literate society. So one of the things that Alter talks about is that a lot of this repetition came out of the idea that these stories are supposed to be told orally. And I think we still do tell a lot of these stories orally. And certainly the way many of our services are, people get up and to the lectern and read these stories orally. But there has been a move to using more and more imagery. And my husband studies communications, and I know one of the things that they often talk about is how we're now bombarded in this age with images. And so there's been more and more of a turn to wanting to have images. And even our churches have added screens, and there's a need for visuals, and people want to see what they're hearing. And so what does that mean for some of this repetition? We're not going to repeat images over and over, probably in the same way. And so what do we lose when we switch from kind of this oral tradition and oral repetitiveness into images? And how do we deal with that? And what does that mean? And are people less patient and less willing to listen to these stories and deal with this repetition? Are there people that just want to go on with it and move on? And what does that look like? And what does that mean about the relevancy of some of what Alter's talking about for today? Also just wanted to finish up by sort of pointing out that Alter comes from kind of a literary basis when he's looking at the scripture. So he's really looking at, what is sort of what is it about these as stories? But of course, for people of faith, these are more than just stories. There's a difference. Alter talks quite a bit about King Lear, and somehow some of the same literary devices are used elsewhere in literature. But for us, these stories have kind of a greater significance. And so Alter's looking at them as purely literature and looking at the technique that the storyteller used kind of from a literary perspective. What do we lose in doing that? Or is there an inherent bias in doing that towards the stories being stories instead of the stories being divinely inspired? What does that mean for us, and what does that look like? So I just wanted to thank anyone who watches this, and thank you for the opportunity to further reflect on Alter and this idea of repetition in the Hebrew scripture.